Jesus was famous for teaching in parables: the sower, the lost sheep, the mustard seed, the Good Samaritan, the Prodigal Son. Those stories are so closely connected with Jesus that it is easy to assume every gospel must be full of them. Then you open the Gospel of John, and something strange happens. The familiar parables are almost completely gone. John never tells the story of the Good Samaritan. He never gives us the prodigal son. He does not record the sower, the weeds, the talents, the 10 virgins, or the mustard seed in the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. Instead, John gives us water turned into wine, a nighttime conversation about being born again, a man born blind, a shepherd and his sheep, bread from heaven, a vine and its branches, and Lazarus walking out of a tomb. So why does John sound so different? Did he know a different version of Jesus? Did he intentionally leave the parables out? Or is the absence itself telling us something about what John is trying to do? The answer starts with one important correction. Saying that John has no parables is useful shorthand, but it is not literally exact. John does contain figurative teaching. In John 10, Jesus speaks about sheep, a gate, thieves, and a shepherd, and the gospel itself calls this a figure of speech. In John 15, Jesus says, "I am the true vine," and describes his followers as branches. In John 16, Jesus even acknowledges that he has been speaking in figures. So the real mystery is more precise. Why does John leave out the familiar story parables that dominate Jesus' teaching in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And once you ask the question that way, a much bigger pattern appears. Because John did not simply remove one teaching method. He built the entire gospel around a different set of tools, and those tools reveal what John most wants the reader to see about Jesus. To understand the difference, we first need to remember what a gospel is not. A gospel is not a courtroom transcript that tries to preserve every sentence Jesus ever spoke in exact chronological order. None of the 4 canonical Gospels claims to give us everything Jesus said and did. In fact, John states the opposite near the end of his book. John says that Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that were not written in this book. Then he gives his reason for choosing the material he did include. These things were written so that the reader may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing may have life in his name. That statement is one of the most important clues in the entire gospel. John openly tells us that he is selective. He knows more material than he records. He chooses scenes. He chooses conversations. He chooses signs. He arranges them so that they lead the reader toward a conclusion about Jesus. That does not mean the stories are invented. It means selection is part of authorship. If you took 10 witnesses to the same person's life and asked each one to write a 40-page account, no 2 books would contain exactly the same events. One writer might focus on public speeches. Another might focus on private conversations. Another might focus on conflict. Another might focus on turning points. The 4 Gospels work in a similar way. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often called the Synoptic Gospels because they share so much material and can often be placed side by side. John stands apart. He contains many episodes and extended conversations that the other 3 do not record, and it leaves out many episodes they share. The missing parables belong to that larger pattern. They are not an isolated oddity. They are one part of the reason John feels like a different window into the same Jesus. Now consider how parables function in the Synoptic Gospels. Again and again, Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is like," or "the kingdom of heaven is like." Then he gives a picture from ordinary life. Seed falls on different kinds of soil. A tiny mustard seed becomes something much larger. A woman mixes leaven into flour. A shepherd leaves 99 sheep to find one. A father receives a son who has wasted everything. The stories are memorable because they begin with familiar things and then make the listener see them differently. A field becomes a picture of reception. A banquet becomes a picture of invitation and refusal. A debt becomes a picture of mercy. A harvest becomes a picture of judgment. A seed becomes a picture of hidden growth. And the parables do more than make truth simple. Sometimes they expose the listener. They force a response before the listener realizes where the story is going. Nathan did something similar with David in the Old Testament. He told a story that caused David to judge the case before discovering that the story was about him. Jesus' parables can work in that same unsettling way. The Good Samaritan does not merely answer the question, "Who is my neighbor?" It overturns the categories the questioner is trying to protect. The Prodigal Son is not merely about a rebellious younger brother. It ends with the older brother outside the celebration, forcing religious listeners to ask which son they resemble. The parables also create a strange division between hearing and understanding. In Mark 4 and Matthew 13, the disciples ask Jesus about his use of parables. Jesus speaks about the mystery of the kingdom being given to some while others hear without truly perceiving. The story is public, but understanding requires more than simply hearing the words. So in the Synoptics, parables are deeply connected to the kingdom, to response, and to the question of who truly sees what God is doing. John is interested in all of those things, but he usually gets there by another route. The first major replacement is what John calls signs. John does not merely say that Jesus performed miracles. He repeatedly frames certain works as signs. A sign is not important only because something extraordinary happened. A sign points beyond itself. At Cana, water becomes wine. The event matters, but John immediately tells us what it did. Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Later, Jesus heals an official's son. He feeds a crowd. He walks on the sea. He gives sight to a man born blind. He raises Lazarus from the dead. Readers often speak about 7 signs in John, though different counting schemes can vary depending on what is included. The more important point is not the exact number. It is John's repeated connection between what Jesus does and what those actions reveal. The signs create the kind of interpretive pressure that parables create in the Synoptics. You see something concrete, and then you have to ask what it means. At Cana, the question is not merely, how did water become wine? It becomes, what does this reveal about Jesus, his hour, and the new thing God is doing? When 5,000 people are fed, the crowd wants more bread. Jesus turns the event into a long discussion about the bread of life. The physical sign becomes a doorway into identity. When the blind man receives sight in John 9, the chapter becomes a trial about who can actually see. The man who was physically blind increasingly recognizes Jesus, while the religious authorities who can physically see become more resistant. When Lazarus comes out of the tomb, the event is not just an emotional rescue. It frames Jesus' claim, "I am the resurrection and the life," and it accelerates the conflict that will lead to the cross. In other words, John often does with events what the Synoptics do with stories. He places something visible in front of the reader and asks, "Do you understand what you are seeing?" That is why it is too simple to say, the Synoptic Gospels have parables, and John has none. A better contrast is this. The Synoptics often give us short story parables that interpret the kingdom, while John often gives us symbolic signs that generate long conversations about Jesus. And once you see that pattern, John's famous "I am" sayings make even more sense. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the true vine. These are not narrative parables like the Good Samaritan. There is no miniature plot with several characters and a surprise ending, but they are intensely figurative. Jesus takes ordinary realities, bread, light, a doorway, a shepherd, a road, a vine, and makes them carry enormous theological weight. The images work because the listener already knows what the object does. Bread sustains life. Light exposes and guides. A gate controls entrance. A shepherd protects and leads. A vine gives life to branches. John turns those images toward the identity and mission of Jesus. This gives us the second major clue. John's gospel is less interested in repeatedly asking, "What is the kingdom like?" and more interested in repeatedly asking, "Who is Jesus?" That is not because the kingdom disappears from John. Jesus speaks about entering and seeing the kingdom in his conversation with Nicodemus. Pilate questions him about kingship. The language of rule, life, judgment, glory, and mission is everywhere. But John's center of gravity is different. He keeps pulling the reader toward the person of Jesus himself. Who is the one who gives living water? Who is the bread from heaven? Who is the light? Who is the shepherd? Who is the resurrection? Who can say that seeing him is seeing the Father? The teaching method serves that purpose. There is another technique in John that is easy to miss because it is so different from a parable. Misunderstanding. A character hears Jesus say something and takes it at the most literal level possible. Jesus then uses the misunderstanding to reveal a deeper meaning. Nicodemus hears that he must be born again, or born from above, and asks how an adult can enter the womb a second time. The Samaritan woman hears about living water and thinks about the difficulty of drawing water from a well. Jesus speaks about raising this temple in 3 days, and his opponents think he is talking about the building in Jerusalem. He tells his disciples that Lazarus has fallen asleep, and they think ordinary sleep might help him recover. After the feeding of the 5,000, the crowd thinks about bread for the stomach, while Jesus keeps pushing toward the bread that gives life. This pattern occurs so often that it becomes one of John's signature teaching engines. A synoptic parable can hide truth inside a story. A Johannine misunderstanding can hide truth inside ordinary language. In both cases, the listener has to move from the surface to the deeper reality, and John frequently puts the reader in a privileged position. We often understand more than the character on the page because the narrator has already given us clues. Nicodemus is confused about new birth, but the reader has already heard in the opening chapter that those who receive the word are given the right to become children of God, born not by ordinary human descent, but of God. The crowd is confused about bread, but the reader has already seen Jesus multiply it. Martha speaks about resurrection on the last day, and Jesus turns the future doctrine into a present claim about himself. I am the resurrection and the life. John is constantly teaching the reader how to see beneath the first layer. This is where the title of the video becomes more interesting. John does not record the famous parables, but John's gospel itself often behaves like an extended exercise in interpretation. People see a sign and misunderstand it. They hear a saying and take it literally. They meet Jesus and form an incomplete conclusion. Then the story keeps pressing until the deeper identity of Jesus comes into view. That structure creates a different reading experience from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the Synoptics, You may hear a compact parable in 30 seconds and spend the rest of the day thinking about it. In John, a single image may unfold across an entire chapter. Take the shepherd imagery in John 10. Jesus begins with sheep, a sheepfold, a gatekeeper, thieves, and a shepherd. John 10:6 explicitly tells us that Jesus used a figure of speech, and the listeners did not understand it. That line is crucial because it proves that John is not allergic to figurative teaching. Then Jesus expands the imagery. He identifies himself with the gate. He identifies himself as the Good Shepherd. He speaks about laying down his life for the sheep. He speaks of other sheep, one flock, and one shepherd. The image is not a short narrative parable, but it functions as a symbolic world the listener has to enter. John 15 does something similar with the vine. Jesus does not tell a story about a farmer who planted a vineyard and then give the moral. He says directly, "I am the true vine, my Father is the gardener, and you are the branches." Then he develops the consequences: abiding, fruitfulness, pruning, dependence, love, obedience. John's figurative teaching is often less like a tiny story and more like an extended metaphor woven into a discourse. So why would John prefer this style? We have to be careful here. The Gospel never gives us a sentence that says, "I left out the parables for these 3 reasons." Any explanation of the author's precise editorial process is partly inference, but John does give us enough information to make a strong observation. The Gospel repeatedly organizes material around revelation, testimony, signs, belief, and life. From the opening lines, the question is identity. The Word is with God and is God. The Word becomes flesh. John the Baptist testifies about Jesus. Disciples ask where he is staying. Nathanael asks whether anything good can come from Nazareth. Nicodemus comes at night. The Samaritan woman asks whether he is greater than Jacob. The crowd asks for a sign. Religious leaders argue about his origin. Pilate asks whether he is a king. Thomas finally says, "My Lord and my God." The book is filled with witnesses, questions, claims, and decisions. Near the end, John tells us the goal. These signs are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and have life in his name. That purpose statement fits the literary choices we have been tracing. John's signs, metaphors, and dialogues keep forcing the reader to answer one central question: what will you do with Jesus? A short kingdom parable could certainly serve that purpose. But John does not need to reproduce the same teaching collection the synoptics already preserve. He has other material, and he arranges it around his stated goal. This also helps explain why the absence of the parables should not be turned into a conspiracy. Sometimes people encounter the differences between John and the synoptics and assume one gospel must be correcting, contradicting, or replacing the others. But difference is not automatically contradiction. If Matthew records the parable of the talents and John does not, John has not denied that Jesus told it. Silence is not denial. If John records the raising of Lazarus and Mark does not, Mark has not denied that Lazarus was raised. A writer can omit a true event simply because it does not serve the structure or scope of that particular account. The harder questions arise when the Gospels present events or sayings differently, and those deserve careful study on their own terms. But the absence of a story is not by itself a contradiction. In fact, John's own ending prepares us for omission. He says Jesus did many other things not written in the book. Then the final verse of the Gospel uses deliberate exaggeration to make the same point. If everything Jesus did were written down, the world itself could not contain the books. The rhetorical message is obvious. John knows his book is selective. That means the right question is not, why did John fail to include the parables? As though he accidentally forgot the most famous teaching method of Jesus. The better question is, what did John choose to include instead, and what does that choice accomplish? Once you ask that question, the gospel becomes easier to read. Look at the opening half of John. John does not begin with a genealogy or a birth narrative. He begins before creation. In the beginning was the Word. That tells you immediately that identity is going to dominate the book. Then testimony begins. John the Baptist identifies Jesus. Andrew tells Simon. Philip tells Nathanael. Nathanael confesses. The reader is being introduced to a chain of witnesses. Then comes Cana. The first sign reveals glory. Then the temple. Jesus speaks about the destruction and raising of the temple of his body. Then Nicodemus. The conversation becomes a lesson on new birth, the Spirit, the Son of Man, and God's love for the world. Then the Samaritan woman. A request for water becomes a discussion of living water, worship, Messiah, and harvest. Then an official's son is healed. Then a man at Bethesda is healed, leading to conflict over the Sabbath and an extraordinary discourse about the Son's relationship to the Father. Then bread is multiplied, leading to the bread of life discourse. Then Jesus appears at the Feast of Tabernacles and speaks about living water and light. Then the man born blind becomes a living case study in sight and blindness. Then the shepherd imagery. Then Lazarus. This is not a gospel that lacks teaching. It is saturated with teaching. It simply embeds that teaching in a different architecture. Instead of moving rapidly from one short parable to another, John often gives us a sign, a confrontation, a misunderstanding, and then a long theological unpacking. The result is slower, more meditative, and more focused on layers of identity. And that difference becomes especially clear when we compare the phrase, "the kingdom of God is like," with the phrase, "I am." In the synoptic parables, the comparison often points outward toward God's reign. The kingdom is like seed, treasure, yeast, a net, a banquet. In John, the comparison repeatedly points inward toward Jesus. I am bread. I am light. I am the gate. I am the shepherd. I am the resurrection. I am the way. I am the vine. That is not a rigid formula. The synoptics also make enormous claims about Jesus, and John also speaks about the kingdom. But the contrast is still useful. Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us many windows into what God's kingdom is like. John gives us many windows into who Jesus is and what happens when people encounter him. This is why the gospel can feel almost like a sequence of revelations. A sign happens. A claim follows. People divide. Some believe. Some resist. The stakes rise. At Cana, disciples believe. After the temple controversy, many believe because of the signs. But Jesus does not entrust himself to them. Nicodemus comes uncertain. The Samaritan village believes. The crowd chases bread. Some disciples leave after the bread of life discourse. The blind man moves toward worship while leaders move toward rejection. Lazarus is raised, and some believe while others report Jesus to the authorities. The signs never function as neutral spectacle. They expose the heart. That is remarkably close to what parables do in another form. Now we can return to one of the most important texts for this entire question, John 10:6. After Jesus speaks about the sheepfold and shepherd, John says, Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Different English translations handle the underlying word in different ways. Some older translations use parable, Many modern translations use figure of speech, illustration, or similar wording. That translation difference is one reason the slogan, "John has no parables," must be handled carefully. The Greek term in John is not the same term normally used for the synoptic parables. The synoptics commonly use parable. John uses paroemia, a term that can refer to figurative, veiled, proverbial, or symbolic speech. We do not need to turn that into a secret word study. The practical point is simple. John distinguishes his own kind of figurative speech from the classic narrative parables that readers know from the other Gospels. The same term appears again in John 16:25, when Jesus tells the disciples that he has spoken to them in figures and that a time is coming when he will speak more plainly about the Father. So John explicitly knows that Jesus speaks figuratively. The mystery, therefore, is not whether Jesus uses images in John. He absolutely does. The mystery is why John preserves those images in a different form. And again, the answer appears to lie in the Gospel's larger design. Symbolic sayings are tied tightly to Jesus' identity, the signs he performs, and the decision the reader must make about him. This is where we should resist another common mistake, assuming that a difference in style proves a difference in speaker. Some readers say, "The Jesus of John sounds so different from the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that the words cannot belong to the same person." That conclusion is far too quick. Real people speak differently in different settings. A public story to a crowd is not the same kind of speech as a private conversation at night. A debate in Jerusalem is not the same as a story told from a boat by the lake. A farewell address to close disciples is not the same as a short answer to a hostile question. John also gives us much more of certain settings. Chapters 13 through 17, for example, slow down dramatically around Jesus' final meal and farewell teaching. The synoptics preserve other material from that period, but not the same extended discourse. At the same time, serious scholarship does ask how much of the distinctive wording reflects the evangelist's own literary style and theological presentation. Christians do not need to pretend that question does not exist. The important point for our video is narrower. The absence of synoptic-style parables does not by itself prove that John presents a different Jesus. It proves that John presents Jesus through a different literary selection. And the Gospel tells us that selection has a purpose. That purpose is not merely to give information, it is to create belief, or trust, and life. John wants the reader to see the signs and understand what they point to. There is an even deeper way to describe what John is doing. The synoptic parables often ask the listener to imagine a world. Imagine a farmer sowing, a merchant searching, a widow demanding justice, a father waiting for his son. John often makes the gospel narrative itself the world you must interpret. Imagine a wedding where the wine runs out. Imagine a teacher coming to Jesus in darkness. Imagine a woman standing at a well at noon. Imagine a hungry crowd looking for more bread. Imagine a blind man who gradually sees while sighted leaders become more blind. Imagine a tomb where Jesus waits before calling a dead man out. Those are not technically parables. They are narrated events. We should not blur the genres, but as a reading experience, the events can function with a similar pressure. Each story is larger than the surface action. Water, bread, light, blindness, death, shepherding, and harvest all become theological symbols within the narrative. This is one reason John feels so rich on repeated reading. A detail that looked ordinary in chapter 2 may echo later in chapter 6 or chapter 19. Words like life, light, glory, hour, sign, witness, world, believe, and abide keep returning. John is not giving us less symbolism because he gives us fewer parables. He is giving us symbolism everywhere. Consider the conversation with Nicodemus. A synoptic writer might preserve a parable about seed, birth, or entrance into the kingdom. John gives us a respected teacher who arrives at night and says that Jesus must have come from God because of the signs. Jesus immediately shifts the conversation to new birth and the kingdom. Nicodemus misunderstands. Jesus presses deeper. Then the conversation expands toward heavenly things, the Son of Man, the serpent lifted up in the wilderness, God's love for the world, judgment, light, and darkness. The structure is classic John. The scene begins with a concrete question and ends with a cosmic frame. Then compare the Samaritan woman. The scene begins with thirst. Jesus asks for a drink. She is surprised that a Jewish man speaks to her. Jesus mentions living water. She misunderstands the water physically. Jesus turns the conversation toward her life, worship, the Messiah, and finally a harvest in which a Samaritan town comes to believe. Again, a concrete object becomes a doorway to identity. John does not need a parable about a man who found living water. He lets the conversation itself become the vehicle. Then look at John 6. A crowd is fed with bread. They follow Jesus. Jesus tells them not to work merely for food that perishes. They ask for a sign, even though they have just experienced one. They mention manna. Jesus says the true bread comes from the Father and gives life to the world. Then comes the claim, I am the bread of life. The event, the misunderstanding, and the metaphor form one continuous teaching unit. This helps us answer another question. Why do John's speeches sometimes feel so much longer than Jesus' parables? Because John often refuses to separate sign from interpretation. The feeding of the 5,000 is not just a miracle story. It is the beginning of a debate about what kind of bread people actually want. The healing of the blind man is not just a miracle story. It becomes a chapter-long investigation about evidence, authority, fear, exclusion, and spiritual blindness. The raising of Lazarus is not just a miracle story. It becomes a revelation about resurrection, grief, glory, belief, and the decision of the authorities to move against Jesus. In a synoptic parable, the story itself may carry most of the meaning. In John, meaning is often distributed across the event, the conversation, the narrator's explanation, and the reactions of different people. That is why simply counting parables can miss the literary richness of the gospel. John does not give us a list of little stories with morals. He gives us encounters that keep changing meaning as they unfold. There is also a major thematic reason the change in form matters. John is obsessed with revelation. The opening prologue says that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and that the Son makes the Father known. That statement sets the direction of the entire gospel. Jesus is not only a messenger who tells stories about God. In John, Jesus is himself the revelation. That is why so many images collapse toward his identity. Bread is not only something Jesus gives, he says he is the bread. Light is not only something Jesus brings, he says he is the light. Resurrection is not only an event Jesus can cause, he says he is the resurrection and the life. The way to the Father is not only a route Jesus teaches, he says he is the way. The vine is not only an illustration of spiritual life. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. John's literary method fits his theology. The symbols do not merely explain principles, they bring the reader back to the person. This is probably the largest difference the missing parables help us notice. The parables in the Synoptics often make the kingdom visible through story. John often makes Jesus visible through sign and metaphor, and if John's stated goal is that the reader believe Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, that makes perfect sense. But does that mean John is somehow less interested in ethics, discipleship, or the way people should live? Not at all. John simply grounds those things differently. In the Synoptics, a parable like the Good Samaritan can turn the listener toward concrete neighbor love. In John, Jesus washes his disciples' feet and tells them that he has given them an example. In the Synoptics, Jesus teaches about forgiving debt through parables. In John, he gives a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you. In the Synoptics, the kingdom parables describe fruitfulness, faithfulness, watchfulness, mercy, and judgment. In John, the vine imagery describes abiding and bearing fruit. The farewell discourse speaks about obedience, love, unity, hatred from the world, the work of the Spirit, and the mission of the disciples. John's Gospel is not less demanding because it contains fewer parables. If anything, the commands become intensely relational. Remain in me, love one another, follow me, receive my words, bear fruit, testify. The difference is not between story and no application. It is between different ways of connecting the listener to Jesus. There is one more reason the competitor-style title, John has no parables, can be misleading if we are not careful. It may make viewers think John completely abandoned the teaching traditions found in the other Gospels. But many themes overlap even when the form changes. The shepherd is a good example. The Synoptics contain the parable of the lost sheep. John contains an extended shepherd discourse. They are not the same teaching, but both use shepherd imagery to speak about care, belonging, danger, and the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. The Synoptics speak about seed and fruit. John speaks about branches and fruit. The Synoptics use wedding banquets and bridegroom imagery. John opens Jesus' signs at a wedding and includes John the Baptist's language about the bridegroom. The Synoptics speak about light and lamps. John uses light as one of its central theological symbols. So John has not entered a completely different symbolic universe. He often uses the same world of ordinary biblical imagery: bread, sheep, vines, water, light, but arranges it around different scenes and claims. That is one reason the four Gospels belong together so well. They are distinct enough to show different dimensions and similar enough to recognize the same world. At this point, we can answer the central question in 3 layers. First, John does not literally contain 0 figurative sayings. It contains figures of speech and extended metaphors. So the popular claim needs qualification. Second, John omits the familiar synoptic-style narrative parables because the gospel is built around a different literary architecture: signs, identity claims, symbolic metaphors, misunderstandings, testimony, and long dialogues. Third, John tells us why this selection matters. The book chooses material to lead the reader toward belief that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and toward life in his name. That does not allow us to reconstruct every private decision of the author. We cannot prove that John looked at a list of parables and deliberately crossed each one out. But we do not need to. The final form of the gospel is enough to show us what John emphasizes. He wants us to see Jesus, not merely to admire a miracle, not merely to decode a metaphor, not merely to win an argument about gospel differences. He wants every sign, every claim, every conversation, and every misunderstanding to push the reader toward the question the characters themselves keep facing. Who is this man? And this is where John's gospel becomes personally uncomfortable, because the people in John rarely remain neutral. Nicodemus comes at night and slowly moves into the light of public association with Jesus later in the story. The Samaritan woman moves from suspicion to curiosity, to recognition and testimony. The crowd moves from excitement over bread to offense at Jesus' words. Some disciples turn back and no longer walk with him. The man born blind moves from calling Jesus the man to prophet, to someone from God, and finally to worship. The authorities move in the opposite direction. Martha confesses Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God before Lazarus comes out of the tomb. Pilate keeps asking political questions, while the true question of kingship stands in front of him. Thomas moves from demanding evidence to, "My Lord and my God." John's literary design is not a theology lecture floating above real life. It is a series of decisions. The reader is invited to stand among the witnesses and decide what the signs mean. That is also why John's lack of familiar parables can be so powerful. If you come expecting Jesus to say, "The kingdom is like," John often does something more direct. He puts Jesus in front of you and asks whether you recognize him. So how should you read John differently once you notice all of this? Start by watching for 4 movements. First, look for the sign or image. What concrete thing is happening? Wine, water, bread, light, blindness, sheep, death, a vine. Second, watch for misunderstanding. Who sees only the surface? What do they think Jesus means? Third, listen for the identity claim. What does Jesus reveal about himself, the Father, life, judgment, or belief? Fourth, watch the response. Who believes? Who hesitates? Who walks away? Who becomes hostile? Who testifies? That pattern will not appear mechanically in every chapter, but it is common enough to change the way you read the Gospel. It also keeps you from treating John's symbols as random inspirational quotes. "I am the vine" is not a decorative line about spiritual connection. It appears in a farewell setting where Jesus is preparing disciples to live without his visible physical presence. "I am the Good Shepherd" is not merely a comforting picture. It appears in conflict over true and false leadership and moves toward the shepherd laying down his life. "I am the bread of life" is not simply a devotional metaphor. It follows a crowd that wants material bread and confronts them with what they actually seek from Jesus. The symbols have contexts, conflicts, and consequences, and that may be the biggest practical payoff of the whole question. If you read John looking only for the famous parables, you may conclude that something is missing. If you read John on its own terms, you discover that the Gospel has replaced short story parables with a different kind of symbolic density. The signs are not illustrations added after the theology. They are part of the theology. The misunderstandings are not awkward interruptions. They are teaching devices. The I am sayings are not isolated memory verses. They are interpretive keys. The long conversations are not unnecessary repetition. They are the places where surface assumptions are slowly dismantled. John is doing what its ending says it is doing, selecting and shaping witness so that readers who never stood beside the Sea of Galilee, never watched the water become wine, never touched Lazarus, and never saw the risen Jesus with Thomas can still come to believe through testimony. That is a remarkable claim about writing itself. The reader cannot see the signs directly. The reader sees them through the Gospel. The book becomes the witness. Now the opening mystery can finally be answered. Why does the Gospel of John not preserve the parables Jesus is famous for? Not because John has no interest in images. It is full of images. Not because John has no interest in the kingdom. The kingdom is present, though not with the same repeated formula. Not because John has no teaching. It contains some of the longest and most theologically concentrated teaching in the New Testament. And not because the absence automatically proves that John knew a completely different Jesus. The strongest conclusion is simpler and more interesting. John is a selective gospel with a distinct purpose. Where Matthew, Mark, and Luke preserve many of Jesus' short narrative parables, John more often builds meaning through signs, symbolic sayings, misunderstandings, long dialogues, and the reactions of people who encounter Jesus. Those choices all serve the purpose John states near the end, that you may believe Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So the missing parables are not an empty space. They are a clue. They show us that the four Gospels are not four copies of the same book. They are four witnesses that preserve overlapping memories while emphasizing different dimensions of Jesus. And John's dimension is relentlessly personal. Who is Jesus? What do the signs reveal? Will you see what others miss? And what will you do with what you see? That also gives us a natural bridge to the other side of the question. If John helps us understand why one gospel can reveal Jesus without the familiar parable format, then the next question is why Jesus used parables so powerfully in the first place. Why tell stories that some people understand and others do not? Why hide the kingdom inside farmers, seeds, banquets, debtors, sons, sheep, lamps, and vineyards? Why not simply state everything in direct propositions? That question matters because the absence of parables in John only becomes fully visible once we understand what the parables are doing in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So after reading John this way, go back to the parables with a new question. Do not ask only, what is the moral of the story? Ask, what is this story revealing? What assumption is it exposing? And what response is Jesus demanding from the listener? Then come back to John and ask the same thing of the signs. The methods are different. The pressure is surprisingly similar. Both refuse to let the reader remain a spectator. Both force you to see, and both finally bring you back to Jesus.